Bruce Lee versus mixed martial arts, or commonly referred to as just simply MMA. Mixed martial arts. What's the big deal? I think some clarification needs to be made about mixed martial arts. There are some that are under the notion that mixed martial arts is new, relatively. In fact, mixed martial arts is not new at all. It's been around for hundreds of years, actually. We may have not called it that, but it's been around that long. It is something that's confusing to some, but let me go ahead and try to add some help for those who maybe don't know what it is, what it actually is. Mixed martial arts actually is when an individual trains in more than one particular martial arts style or system. I've done mixed martial arts all my life. I know other people who have done mixed martial arts for many, many years as well. So when we see the advent of a business service called the UFC, Ultimate Fighting Championship, championed by the president of that organization at the time, I don't know if he still currently is, Dana White, we would think that what we were watching was actually mixed martial arts. Here's the misconception and the confusion with some is this. Back when the UFC began and the Gracies, with Hoist Gracie being the focal point of that family, when they made the UFC and mixed martial arts popular here in the United States of America and in the world, what they did was popularize fighting in a ring with two opponents, one opponent or adversary, if you will, had studied one martial discipline, let's say boxing, and the other individual studied jiu-jitsu, or one opponent studied Muay Thai or kickboxing, and another opponent that he was pitted against studied wrestling, or one opponent studied some form of kung fu and another opponent studied karate or jiu-jitsu. They called that mixed martial arts. But in actuality, mixed martial arts is when one individual is pitted against another individual who has trained in one particular art, but the first individual has trained in several. Again, let me say that. Let's say if one man studies Goju-Ryu karate and he is faced with another man who studied some form of jiu-jitsu, another form of karate such as let's say Chito-Ryu, and he studies Wing Chun and he studies Muay Thai. The guy that studied those other four arts is in all actuality the mixed martial artist. Such was Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee, in modern day time, was a mixed martial arts master. This was unheard of to many traditional martial arts instructors and masters, in the sense in which he employed his craft or his art. Now, I'm not contradicting myself. Just follow me for a moment. Keep it in context. I did originally state that mixed martial arts has been around for as much as hundreds of years. Now, they didn't look at it particularly in that way. Many karate masters, let's say in the 40s, in the 50s, that studied a form of karate also studied a form of jiu-jitsu that was mixed martial arts. But the incorporation of the other art, jiu-jitsu in this particular sense, did not change the fact that they still studied that one particular martial arts. So generally speaking, when you would ask the martial arts master, what is your school or your rule or your system or style, they would tell you the karate style, and not necessarily the fact that they studied jiu-jitsu or maybe aikijitsu along with that as well. They wouldn't tell you all of that necessarily because they respected the first thing that they studied or trained in. The other two or more arts that they may have studied or incorporated some aspects of them to include kobudo or weapons, if you will, into their art. It was just simply part of their art, their particular style or system. They're not going to run down a whole laundry list. Oh, I study Okinawan Te or Okinawan Karate, such as Shuriru, and I also study this form of Jiu-Jitsu, and I also study this form of Aikido, and so on and so forth. They didn't necessarily run you down that whole list. They would stick to the base or the fundamental thing that they originally started out with. But when the UFC began, it was a situation where they said, well, we have these guys from all over the world participating in this mixed martial arts event. We have mixed martial artists. They've even said that. But in fact, the vast majority of those competitors didn't study several arts as individuals. They only came in there with one. If it was a Muay Thai guy, that's all he did. Versus a jiu-jitsu guy or a judo guy, that's all they did. Or if it was a boxer versus a wrestler, that's all they did. Or if it was a Hapkido man versus a taekwondo guy or a jiu-jitsu guy, that's all they did was that particular craft or that particular art. Dana White himself made the statement that Bruce Lee was the father of mixed martial arts. Now, that could be up to anyone's interpretation, but I'll tell you what he meant in my mind is that when we talk about being diverse and multifaceted as a martial artist, Bruce Lee was that. This is one of the things that turned traditional guys' noses against Bruce Lee and away from him, is the fact that he took it upon himself to incorporate any and everything that benefited him as a martial arts fighter and practitioner. So we all know, or should know by now, that Bruce Lee studied Wing Chun. He studied various other martial arts systems from Kung Fu. He studied Karate. He studied Jiu-Jitsu, American boxing. He also studied Okinawan weaponry, bow, nunchaku, eskrima from the islands that was taught to him by Dan Inosanto, his own student, who also taught him nunchaku, by the way, and Bruce Lee just perfected those things, and so on. And the fact that he also studied fencing and French foot fighting, which is savate. He incorporated these along with other things into his own regimen. And that is what made him so extraordinary as a martial artist. So he was indeed a mixed martial arts master. So if Bruce Lee were still living, and if he had participated in today's MMA, I have no doubt in my mind that he would have been very difficult to handle by most of the competitors today. As much as people want to say that he was an actor and he wasn't all that good, and he was only so efficient in Wing Chun up to a level, is to really be looked at as very disingenuous and disrespectful to that man's legacy, because the world sees Bruce Lee as the greatest martial artist of our time. Now, can the world really be deceived by this one individual? I really don't think so. I don't think the world made a mistake when they labeled him the king of Kung Fu, when they labeled him as the little dragon, that man that came from Asia, tore down that curtain that separated the East from the West, making everyone want to do Kung Fu, karate, or some form of martial arts. All thanks to Bruce Lee. So these MMA fighters today, not all of them, but there's a significant amount of them, especially the students of some of these older heads in MMA as we know it, they try and make the statement or the assertion that Bruce Lee wouldn't last against anyone in the present MMA. That is so far from the truth in my mind. If it were not for Bruce Lee and people like Bruce Lee that came up during his time, there would be no MMA fighters or mixed martial arts fighters as we see today of this caliber. If they're really honest, they learned from a lot of the old heads, the older martial arts masters and grandmasters. And things just progressed, they got better. So, what's the premise of this video? It's here in a nutshell. Mixed martial arts, as it relates to the octagon, as some call it or refer to it, we must understand there's a difference when you have one guy that studies one martial discipline versus another guy that studies a totally different martial discipline. Even though that they're two separate arts, that's really not mixed martial arts. That's just two guys who have studied two different things. The real mixed martial arts is the guy that is pitted against another guy, and the first guy again has studied several arts that complement him or her as a martial artist versus the other individual who only studies one. That's real mixed martial arts, like Bruce Lee did. Bruce Lee's not the only one, but he is the one that surfaced. He is the one that caused a lot of Asians to frown on him for breaking the tradition of studying just one particular art. And also we do know that they didn't like the fact that he was teaching Americans, blacks and whites, what was looked at as ancient Chinese secrets, knowledge, and history, and so forth. Because during those times, there was a derision, there was a separation between Asia and America. Bruce Lee broke that barrier down when he came on the scene. So, not to hold you any longer, I'm going to conclude again by saying this. A real mixed martial arts is when one individual has studied several disciplines, not when you have two individuals where both of them studied only one apiece. I think that's simple enough. And again, I say, the guys today, and they're very talented. I give that to them. They're very talented. A lot of them lack what Bruce Lee had, and I believe that Bruce Lee was a humble man. He had certain triggers like anyone else does. He had a temper problem. We all know that. Even he admitted that. But if you watch other fighters, you'll see the same. So he's no different. He was no different. He's a human being like we all are. But he was gracious. He was kind. He was thoughtful, and he was giving as a human being and a martial artist and a philosopher. A lot of these guys today don't know what humility is. That's why you hear a lot of trash talk about one another and also about Bruce Lee's effectiveness as a martial artist, because these guys are missing the humility part. Now there's a lot of guys out there that are still humble, that have come through the ranks of MMA, both old and even present day. One of those that I have always had a great deal of respect for was George St. Pierre. So you can write that on your thumb. I'm not bashing anyone. I'm just saying simply, there are some that are still humble. And he was one on my list. Can you think of some martial arts practitioners in the MMA, past or even present, that were truly humble and devoted to their craft and not full of their own self or ego? I would just like to know. Put it in the comment section below. Take care, brother. Teacher out.